Hey, Isaiah. Let's just start there. Isaiah who? What was God and Isaiah's problem? Bad people. Full on moral corruption. Ah, sinful nation, people laden with iniquity, brood of evildoers, depraved children, they have forsaken God, turned their backs. Every head is ailing, every heart sick from head to foot. Then he says, had I not left a few of you, we should be like Sodom and Amorah. Hear the word of God, you chieftains of Sodom. Give ear to God's instruction, you folk of Gomorrah. What do Isaiah and God want? Tshuva. In particular, though, in what form? Here's what they don't want. Sacrifices. I am sated with burnt offerings of rams. I have no delight in lambs and he-goats that you bring before me. Who asked you? Stop trampling my courts. This one is like, your new moons and fixed seasons fill me with loathing. The observance of holidays has reached a point where it fills God and Isaiah with loathing. They're a burden to me. I can't endure them. When you lift up your hands, when you do the priestly blessing around the sacrifice, I turn my eyes away from you. Though you pray at length, I will not listen. Your hands are stained with crime. Cease to do evil, learn to do good, devote yourselves to justice, aid the wrong, uphold the rights of the orphan, defend the cause of the widow, and then I will turn your sins to crimson, from crimson to snow white. They can become like fleece. Whew. Really? Was it that bad? It was that bad. It was that bad. So why are we reading this today? Really? Because Tisha B'Av is coming. So I just want to point out how unusual it is to just before we commemorate our own destruction, the passage we read does not help us reflect on how powerful our enemies were, but how corrupt we are. So the reason our tradition suggests we ought to read Isaiah's vision before we commemorate the destruction is so that we will do what within our communities? Self-reflect and change. What's unusual about this is that even though biblical, rabbinic, and medieval philosophy believe that our destructions are from our own hands, meaning we caused them with our sinfulness, history shows that the reason we were defeated, the first temple and the second temple, is because empires had armies that were far stronger than ours, and they wanted the land for themselves, and there was going to be no Jewish people with any army, which we had both during the first temple period and the second temple period, that could have stopped them. But that's not how we tell our story. We tell our story, at least theologically, from a place of who are we in the moment in which we are coming apart at the seams. I'm not putting a value statement on that. I'm just telling you that's what we've always done. That's what we've always done. And I have to say, when I go into that process, especially right now in which I am feeling enemies from every single angle coming down on us, there is a sense of there's no winning and there's no losing right now. There's only being backed into corners without any way out, and that includes with the ways in which we talk about who we are. It becomes harder and harder to do the kind of self-reflection necessary to move forward when there are so many outside forces wishing us, I don't know, gone. So I have this text sheet in front of you. I want to show you a few ways in which this has come up. But David White, it's the text in the middle of the first page. He said pretty well what it is I feel like many of us are feeling here, and then and certainly I'm going to talk about my friends that I've spoken to in Israel this week. To feel crowded, set upon, blocked by circumstances. In defeat or victory, we feel this way. It's not only the daily experience of most human beings in most contemporary societies that has been the abiding dynamic of individual life since the dawn of human consciousness. To feel crowded, set upon, blocked by circumstances is the human condition if we are living in community or even alone, especially amidst other nations. Like the walls are coming down all around us. So as I was speaking to friends in Israel this week, there's this like thick air of anticipation that something is happening, something is going to happen, and yet life is still sort of going on in many ways. My friend, many of them, they would take this, we'd call it, what's it feel like? They would tell me what it feels like. It's like, and then we do like the tour of the ma'amad, of the safe room. I'm always interested in like what kind of food people keep in there, and people were happy to tell me about it, show me the games that they have in there, show me their Shabbat, in case they would have been in there. I don't know what's happening right now, but maybe they are in there right now. What kind of Shabbat hacks exist within there, depending on how long one might have to stay. And also, while feeling this extreme anxiety around what might happen from Hezbollah, Iran, and still, of course, the war in the south, my friends, my family, each and every one of them talked about the threat they felt more so than any of those, which was the internal threat. Because in the same week that is happening, army bases were stormed twice by Israeli citizens. It's bad. It's bad when the army has to fend off its own in Israel. In the same week, the Minister of Finance, Smotrich, talked about the legitimacy of starving to death 2 million Gazans. And Ben-Gvir provoked once again at the Temple Mount, which is to say every Israeli that I spoke to both talked about the external threats and the internal threats. What does it mean to feel crowded upon, set upon, blocked by circumstances such that there feels like there's no way out? It's when you feel like you're being attacked from every direction all the time. That is what it feels like right now for the majority, not all, of Israelis. And to a certain extent, I think we feel not that precise feeling, but a bit of that here with sort of feeling like the walls are coming down. If you just think about the debate around Josh Shapiro's nomination, it was a lose-lose from the people within my Jewish world. If Shapiro was picked, we were worried about some kind of anti-Semitism that might happen. And if he wasn't picked, we were worried it was because of anti-Semitism that he wasn't picked. No matter what, the only way we could read the tea leaves was through anti-Semitism. I don't want to talk about the reality of whether that's true or not. I just want to acknowledge that we as a Jewish community in 2024 are having those thoughts normally, as if it's okay for us to just assume it's coming from both directions, no matter what, that's what it's going to be. Again, whether it is or not, everybody has their own opinion. Unless you are in the room with the decision makers, I'm uninterested for the most part. But we feel it. We feel it. Even now, our moral compasses oftentimes feel like they are under a barrage. When I know that Khan Yunis is being evacuated once again, and that there are grandmothers and babies who are now moving as refugees within Gaza for the 15th time. And also, it's being done so that my family members, the soldiers of whom I am damn proud after all of these months, can be safer too in the war that they have to wage, have been asked to. feels like it comes from every direction. I was listening this week to For Heaven's Sake, Rabbi Daniel Hartman, and Yossi Klein Halevi. If you haven't listened to For Heaven's Sake, you got to listen to it. Every week, Wednesdays, it drops. The two of them are debating their understanding of what it means to be an Israeli during wartime. And this week, they were talking about the assassinations of Shukar and Chania. And they went in both basically saying, like, yes, these are justified assassinations. And then as it happens in these podcasts, Daniel will drop sort of a really tough moral question on Yossi. And Yossi, who comes in usually very sure about his position, ends up leaving thinking, well, now I'm a little confused. And here, really, both of them agreed with the assassinations in practice. And Daniel wanted to ask questions about potential consequences. By the way, if we have that conversation here about potential consequences of those actions, we will be anti-Israel. But for them to have that conversation, it's just being Israeli. And the Israeli conversation they had was, should we have considered more thoughtfully the consequences of those actions? Are we ready for what's coming based on what they would bring? And Yossi Klein Halevi started the conversation with absolutely no moral ambivalence or ambiguity whatsoever. And I took the transcript of how they finished the conversation. He said, you know, Daniel, one of the problems I have with our conversation is that it disorients me. A good conversation or debate between friends in which there is disagreement in a healthy way ought to disorient each person from their position. I don't want to be equivocal about these assassinations. I came into our conversation determined to defend the legitimacy, the necessity of the assassinations. And then I get disoriented. I go home and I continue the argument with myself, with you in my head. And look, I'm deeply grateful. That's the truth. But I think what I'm trying to say is it's really difficult when you're in this kind of situation to have this kind of conversation. When you feel so existentially threatened, you need to be certain. You know, you need to put a limit on self-examination. And yet, where will we be as a people if we shut that down? Which is to say, self-examination is unbelievably difficult when we are feeling threatened externally and internally from every direction. The idea that I'm supposed to look at my faults in that moment when I feel like my life or my society or my community or my nation may be on the line is an anathema to the way in which many of us will think here in these communities. And yet, he ends with, if we don't do that, who will we be? And Daniel says back to him, see, where I agree with you is that I'm not filled with any moral anxiety, which means they both ended up agreeing that the assassinations with those opportunities had to happen or were right to happen. I don't know if they said had to happen. That's where I started. I'm with you. I don't have moral anxiety about the right of Israel to defend itself or whether Hania shouldn't be alive or not. And I felt the same way. So in that sense, I'm joining you in your initial statement of clarity. And still, what is the direction we want to go in as a country? Part of why we read Isaiah, even in a year that we feel unbelievably threatened or different than we have in years past. I don't want to tell you how you feel. Different than we have in years past. 2024, 5784 has been different. Whatever level of threat you feel, everybody's feeling something different. We still read Isaiah, who is telling us to figure out why you are horrible. We still read it. And when the rabbis reflected on why the temples were destroyed, they always, each and every time, ascribed it to their own behavior and not the fact that their enemies were bigger and stronger and wanted the land, which is the historical truth. Here are a few examples of that. Some of these will be familiar to you and some of them will not. In the Bavli, Tractate Yoma, the one that is most familiar, this is the bottom of the front page. For what reason was the first temple destroyed? Due to three matters. Avodah zarah, gilui arayot, shfichut damim, idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. This is what Isaiah is talking about. Israel has become absolutely corrupt. Nothing that we created the nation of Israel for, now ancient Israel, to create a new kind of society in the ancient Near East, none of it exists, and therefore God took us out. use the Babylonian army as the tool. However, during the Second Temple period, we were engaged in Torah, mitzvot, acts of kindness. We weren't doing the other stuff. We were better. So why was the Second Temple destroyed yet if we had left our moral corruption and lived into who we were meant to be, ought to be as Jews? Well, this is the one that is most famous, sinat chinam, because there was hatred. And that, in fact, is part of the story of the Second Temple and why it was destroyed. As the siege on Jerusalem was happening over time, Jews were killing themselves inside of the walls. And they were going slowly and waiting for us to do it so that it would be easier. Now, could they have done it anyway, and would they have over time? Yes. The Roman army was going to knock us out if they wanted to. We just made it easier. This comes to teach you that the sin of sinat chinam, wanton hatred, is equivalent to the 3 transgressions of idol worship, forbidden sexual relations, and bloodshed. Why? The consequence is the same. We lost the temple either way. So great, be better Jews with the mitzvot, even acts of kindness, but if you still hate one another, you're going to end up in the same place you did when you were fully morally corrupt. It's great. Flip the page. Here's the text that people are not as familiar with. There's an entire sugya in Tractate Shabbat. Abaye said Jerusalem was destroyed because people desecrated Shabbat. B. Rabbi Abahu said Jerusalem was destroyed because people didn't say Shema in the morning and at night. Rav Hamnuna said Jerusalem was destroyed because school children were diverted from study. Ula said Jerusalem was destroyed because people had no shame before one another, which means they treated people poorly without any shame whatsoever. It was natural to be mean to one another. Rabbi Yitzchak said Jerusalem was destroyed because its small and great were equated, which is to say no distinctions were made between the context of 2 individuals or their jobs as to what would happen usually in a court of law. When you treat everybody equally, you usually don't get equity. The small and the great can't be treated equally because their life circumstances are different. The moment in which we treated everybody as if the law should be applied equally was the moment in which we had a problem. Rav Amram said that Jerusalem was destroyed because the people did not rebuke one another. Live in a culture in which anything goes and nobody is afraid to say you've crossed a line. That is a culture that will come apart at its seams. That's why our rabbis understand the beginning of the book of Devarim that we read this morning as a giant rebuke from Moses to the people. He named all of the places that we messed up. That's what those places are. So don't think that a community in which there is no rebuke, in which somebody can't say something that they feel about what is happening is wrong, is going to be better than one in which everybody is quiet all the time. Rabbi Yehuda said Jerusalem was destroyed because they disparaged Torah scholars. Now, you know that Torah scholars wrote this, right? But the moment in which we don't treat our experts with honor is a moment in which nobody gets treated with honor. And Rava said Jerusalem was destroyed because there were no more trustworthy people, people of truth. Then another one from Bava Metzia at the bottom, Jerusalem was destroyed because cases were decided according to strict Torah law. People did not go beyond the letter of the law. That matches up with E above of everybody being treated small and great equally. Look, Isaiah noticed moral corruption in society and gave a vision for what it ought to look like such that it would be worthy of God's protection. The rabbis are doing that here as well. This is an outline for what community ought to look like. No wanton hatred. Sacred time being respected, prayerfulness being part and parcel of what it means to be in community, and that every time I say God is at the center, I recognize I am not. Education is valued highly. There is shame in corruption. Distinctions matter. Moral indifference, no space for it. Experts are treated with honor. And truth is the glue that holds society together. As I said earlier in the service, in honor of Jerry Garcia's Yortzeit, which was yesterday, one of the things he said is there is no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about. There is no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Rereading these 3 passages from the Talmud about why the temple was destroyed from the perspective of the rabbis, not the historical perspective, helps me once again to frame what it is the Jewish community can and ought to care about together. And it doesn't all fit into a neat box, and it's certainly not going to fit in any kind of partisan box. It's just, I think, what Isaiah would have said, I'm proud of that, and God's proud of that. So is it hard to self-reflect when we are feeling besieged externally and internally? It is. It feels harder, but it's no less important because sometimes it is these moments in which our deepest and truest values gain and